This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. Learn more online or subscribe at beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew.
This episode is brought to you by craftbeer.com, home of the most powerful brewery locator in the universe. Whether you're traveling in a new city or planning your next beer-cation, head to craftbeer.com and explore the wide world of American craft beer. Want to support small and independent breweries? Look for the Independent Craft Brewer seal when you search. Hi everybody, it's John Hall, the senior editor of Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine, and I'm in a busy hotel lobby because judging just got finished at the first round of judging at the Great American Beer Festival. And this might be airing a little bit after GABF, but you can hear the excitement and sort of the relief in so many of the judges' voices in our background. And my guest who's sitting across from me today is Fal Allen, who is a judge here at GABF, but more importantly is the brewmaster at Anderson Valley Brewing Company in California and the author of the new book, Goses, Brewing a Classic German Beer for the Modern Era. Fal, thanks for being here, first of all.
Well, thanks for having me.
Why in 2018 is this the right time to write a book on Goses?
Well, certainly it is the right time to write the book on Goses because Goses hasn't been this popular since in 1908, probably, the last time it was this popular. Goses is a strange beer, and it's strange in a lot of ways. One of the ways it's strange is it may be the oldest known beer style in the world. It's at least 800 years old, and probably a little bit older than that, maybe even 1,000 years old. And 1,000 years ago, there were really only kind of two kinds of beers. There were brown beers that are high in alcoholic strength and made with gruit. And there were white beers, Weiss beers, which, means basically white. And the difference was that the brown beers were a lot more alcoholic, and that's kind of what gave them their preservative quality.
Okay.
And the white beers were usually made of wheat, although not always. And they didn't have a whole lot of alcohol. Neither of those beers had any hops in them. So they became sour quickly. They were often drunk quite young, and they became sour pretty quick afterwards, if not immediately. And so every beer style that has come over the last 1,000 years has mostly died out or, come up since then. Lagers didn't exist. Porters, stouts didn't exist. They probably came out of that brown beer family. But any modern style of beer that we have hasn't been around 800 years.
Right.
And Goses is one of the few of them. So one of the things that makes Goses cool is the history of Goses is really the history of brewing. And
what do you mean by that?
well, if you think about it, 800 years ago, we know there was Goses 800 years ago.
I wasn't around, but yeah.
Yeah, I wasn't either. I'm old, but not that old. I feel that way some mornings.
Papazian might have been here, but yeah, it's...
I don't even think he's that old. But 800 years ago, brewers didn't take notes because nobody wrote. There was no paper, there was no pen, there was no pencils. Recipes were handed down and memorized. All of the vessels used in brewing, except for the kettle, were made of wood. Lautering was done through straw or sticks. They didn't know what yeast was or what action it had. Nobody used hops. There were no thermometers, no hydrometers, no pH meters. Everything was done really by the seat of your pants. So everything was fired with wood or coke or coal. Mm-hmm. So things were smoky. Whether this beer was smoky or not, it's hard to say, but definitely everything else was. Your clothes were, you were.
But you get the early versions. There's probably a good bet that there was a little bit of a smoke content to it.
Yeah, possibly. Randy Mosier is your guy to talk to about that. He and I have had lengthy discussions about that.
If he returns my calls, I'll ask him. Yeah,
okay. I talked to Randy today a little bit about it. He's also judging here.
Yeah.
And he said that there are two things that we don't some people you don't even know about. One of them is Luftmalt. Luftmalt is an air-dried malt, so there was no kilning at all. And every maltster that I talked to in researching the book, when I came across this term, Luftmalt, had no idea what I was talking about, even the Germans.
Really?
Yeah, they were like, well, I don't know what that is. And I talked to a guy from the Great Western Malting, and he said, well, all the flavors that we associate with malt, biscuity, bready, toasty, all those things come from the kilning process. And so without kilning it, malt will be very different tasting. And I said, well, what do you think it would be like? And, most maltsters taste their product as they go along.
Yeah.
And he said, I've never done that, but my guess would be that it'd be, quite grassy, clover, hay, those sorts of, flavors and aroma. And so a friend of mine grows wheat malt at home. I got some from him. I malted it. I air dried it. It certainly didn't get as dry as kilned malt, so it won't store as well. You have to use it right away. And it certainly had a lot of the flavors that he talked about, and none of the biscuity flavors, no roasty, biscuity, bready flavors.
So the things we think of today, didn't exist in this early...
Right.
Yeah.
So if they were kilning their malt, they would have had to do it over some sort of heat source where they would have had to go harvest probably wood themselves and do it. And that's a lot of extra labor. So this, air drying of malt, which was done both in Germany and in Belgium, there's records of it, it was probably how these white beers were made with this air dried malt. So the flavors that we even associate with beer would be quite different. And one of the things that the air drying does, you make a very light colored, hazy white beer.
Yeah.
And that's why they're called white beers. So the process is very easy to do. I did it at home, and if I can do it at home, anybody can do it at home.
That's the master brewer, but yeah.
Well, come on, I'm not a malter. I'm not a maltster. That was the first time I'd ever tried malting at home. And
Is that true?
Yeah, it was quite fun. And it was so easy to do. And now you can order online all kinds of crazy wheat malt or barley malt from wherever. There's all kinds of people doing micro, farming of this stuff. And there are hundreds of varieties, or at least dozens, maybe not hundreds, but dozens. So you can get a lot of interesting flavors.
Yeah.
And malt them right at home yourself and have some
How
fun.
did you set that up at home?
I did it in a pan.
Okay.
I got a bucket. You put the malt in. You put water on top of it.
Yeah.
You let it go for, I don't remember how many hours, something like 8 hours.
So you start in the morning, and then it's like a crock pot kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah, except for you don't heat it.
Yeah.
So it soaks up the water, and you
I just mean
drain it.
time-wise. It's a slow burn kind of, yeah.
So you
or
drain
slow
it.
process, yeah.
Yeah. And it takes a couple days. So you drain it, and then refill it up, and, at some point you drain off most of the water, keep the malt, moist until it gets to a certain degree of, sprouting. And I don't recall exactly where that is, but find it online.
Yeah.
And I even talk about it some in the book.
Mm-hmm.
I go through the whole process in the book. And when it gets to a certain stage, you quit putting water on it. It starts to dry out. And if it's, you can't really do this in the winter where if it's wet, because it doesn't dry out enough and then it'll mold. But you certainly can do it in the summer, and they would assist by putting it out in a windy area or putting it in the attic of a house, so it would be hotter up there.
Yeah.
And they dry their malt, in the attic or out in an open area on the dirt, the compacted dirt. And they'd shovel up and brew with it. And they'd brew into a wooden vessel using stalks of barley or hay as a bed to louder through, and they put, often for Goses, they used spruce branches and twigs, so it would pick up some flavor from that. And
interesting. Okay.
then they would, run it into a, they would do a particle system. So they would, take the first runnings and make what they called the best Krug, or the best, most expensive beer, and then they would do a second and a third and a fourth and sometimes a fifth runnings, where they just put more hot water on top of it. And they would often take the second, third, or fourth and blend them together later after fermentation to make a more common beer. And then for the last version, they would make a table beer, low alcohol beer. It was also called family beer sometimes. And you couldn't drink water 800 years ago.
Of course.
So, it's filled with things that will kill you.
Well, I mean, you could, but it'd kill you.
Yeah. And, if you lived on you were upstream, pristine mountain maybe, but if there was anything in between you and that water, even a forest with deer running through it, you didn't want to drink it.
Yeah.
So people didn't drink water. They drank this light table beer, or the heavy brown beer, and subsequently got nothing done during the day. So we don't have a very good description of Gose from that time, because you got to remember that the printing press didn't get invented until 1400.
Sure.
So, in the 11 and 1200s, very few notes were taken, and usually they were taxation notes. And so we do have Gose being mentioned from the town of Goslar, where the Gose River runs through it, in about, I think it's mid-1200s. And so we know that the beer is at least that old. And you have to assume that if there was a German village of any size anywhere, they were making beer. And the Gose beer is named after the Gose River. And so certainly as soon as people settled in Gose, which was, 850, 900, they started making beer. So there was Gose beer. Now, what was that beer like? We have no idea.
Well, and that's what I wanted to, because I want to talk about what Gose is today, but when you say that we don't know what it was back then, and you're talking about this Luftmalt, and then you're talking about tax records, I'm really curious about how you approached the research of this beer. Because there's been books written about IPA that are definitive, that sort of debunk a lot of the history that's been done, or a lot of the misinformation that's been out there in the past. And same thing with stouts, and same thing with porters, and some of these others. And it really comes with meticulous research. And so I'm wondering how you approached the research into Gose for this book.
Are you saying I just made all that up?
No. I mean, it's what I do on a daily basis, but, it's I can get away with it because I'm fake news, but yeah.
Well, the research was difficult, and the research was difficult for a whole bunch of reasons. One, most of what's written, about German beers is in German. And back in the day, it was in Old German, which I have a hard time reading at all, much less reading and then translating. And the stuff that's even further back, which...
You didn't get an intern?
Well, I actually got a lot of help from this guy named Benedict. Awesome dude. I met him online. He has a website. He's part of the Milk the Funk crew.
Oh, yeah. What a great group.
Yeah. Love those guys. Love that website. Shout out Milk the Funk.
Yeah. Thanks for your support, guys.
Yeah. And if anybody listening to this, if you haven't heard of Milk the Funk and you have any interest in sour beers at all, run to your computer immediately, look it up. It's just awesome.
Oh, yeah.
But this guy Benedict, he was going to be in Berlin when I landed in Berlin to do my research. And we, got together, and he was a super nice guy, and he translated some stuff for me, and he had a bunch of stuff I'd never, seen, and he sent that to me. And then he said, here's an interesting problem. I'm looking at a book now, and he would go to the German libraries and look through things. He says, I'm looking at a book now, and it's maybe in some German, but a lot of it's in Latin, and I don't read Latin. And back 900 years ago, Latin was
that was the language.
That was the language used for any kind of record
writing,
keeping.
Yeah.
So he had to get his girlfriend to decipher some of it, because she speaks some Latin. And, so the research was triply difficult because it's hard to find.
Yeah.
It's not in English.
Right.
It's sometimes not even in German.
Yeah.
And, these are things you wouldn't stumble across. If it hadn't been for Benedict going out and doing a lot of this research, I don't think the book would be as thoroughly researched or interesting. There is Google Books, which they're trying to put every book on the planet.
Yeah, they've run into some issues with that, but at least it's out there.
Yeah, and so that was a great help. I could at least look up titles and, look up some pages and then do my bad German translations. The research for this book was very difficult.
Had you studied German before this?
No, but I've been to Germany a bunch of times. I can noodle about and order a beer anyway.
Okay, well, sure, yeah.
Get a room.
So it's good enough to write a book. That's fine.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I got a lot of help from a lot of people.
It's easy, kids. Yeah.
Christy Switzer did a lot of the translating as well. She speaks German.
Yeah, your publisher and editor at Brewers Publications, who's just one of the best in the biz, if not the best. Yeah.
It's certainly the best in the beer business.
Hands down.
And she's awesome. She was great help, super encouraging. It was great working with her. So I got translations from a lot of different sources. Randy Mosher also did some for me. Was helpful. Ron Pattinson.
Yeah.
Nice guy. Helped me out a lot.
Great historian as well.
Yes, and he has written a gazillion books on beer. So I got a lot of help from a lot of people. I certainly didn't do it on my own in any way. I just mostly collected things and kind of put them together. And, Ron and Benedict had websites that they had, talked about Gose and, other white beers that were out there. And so the research, I had to fly to Germany and go figure out some things myself. Over and over again, you read that Gose is named after the Gose River, which flows through the town of Goslar.
Right. So I want to ask you about this, because when I think of Gose today, so much of it has to do with the water, and I'm thinking of, it's probably brackish, at least. Like there's a little bit of salt content to it or something. Because wherever you go in Germany, there are regional beers, be it the Berliner Weiss, be it the Dunkelweizen, be it the Altbier, be it whatever it is. And I had always just, in the back of my mind, not knowing much about anything, had figured they had access to salt water, which in retrospect now is kind of like, I should look at a map and realize that's not the case. Where does salt come in to Gose? Like, does it come from the river?
Again, we're talking about something that happened 1,800 years ago, so we can't be certain about what's what.
Right.
But I did.
But what do you believe?
Well, I postulate, and I believe this to be true, that the Gose River was never salty. It may have been more minerally than it is now, but it's even not very minerally today. So,
and when you say minerally, like, you're talking like Burton upon Trent, like it has some of that going?
Yeah.
Okay.
So Goslar sprung up because they found metal ore in the mountain nearby, and it became an enormous mining town. The mine was enormous, not the town. And, the mine now is a World Heritage Site, which is kind of cool. And at first, I think some people wrote and said and thought that, the minerals that they were mining were ending up in the river. But that certainly is not true. The Gose River is not very long. It doesn't go through a whole lot of mining. Most of the tailings went into the other river that runs through that town. And eventually, I went to Goslar and I hiked out of town.
Yeah.
Benedict said, you need to try this because he did it and he didn't think the water was salty. And so I hiked out of town and tasted the water, and he's right, it was not salty.
How far out of town did you go?
Mile-ish.
Okay. So it's a stroll. It's not a hike. Like, let's be honest. Like,
Well, I had to get off road a bit. So
I mean, for me, like, I don't exercise, so I'm like, God, a mile. That's terrible. Yeah.
It is maybe a little bit more. I mean, that's outside of town, so I was staying in the middle of town.
I've talked to some homebrewers who go into the mountains here in Colorado with empty jugs, and they know where springs are in the mountains, and they'll hike in 6 miles with empty jugs and fill them, and then carry them back out for their homebrew. I'm like, that's commitment. Like, a mile outside of town is sort of like, let's get the horses, or like, let's get the Chevy, and
yeah.
The Volvo.
It was not hard.
Okay,
but I did have to get off-road some. But so what's odd about the Gose River today is if you go to Goslar, there are little streets called An der Gose, which means on the Gose, and Gose Strasse, Gose Street. And as you wander around town, you're like, I don't get it. How can you have a street named on the Gose when there is no Gose River?
Yeah.
So I went to the museum and I talked to a lot of people, and they all had no idea what I was talking about. But eventually, the town has a website, which is very informative. And the town talks about the history. And I found out through, noodling around in their website that the Gose River, early on, probably around 1000, maybe even 950, when they started to settle the town, they decided the Gose River would be the river they used to supply fresh water for baking and brewing and, whatever. And the Avstock, I think I'm pronouncing that incorrectly, but whatever. The other river...
I'm not even going to attempt, yeah.
The other river in town was going to be used for everything going out of the town, all the wastewater. So mining, processing water, toilets, everything, all of that. So they eventually started to cover the Goses so people couldn't throw their trash into it or poop in it or whatever. And they eventually built a water system, which they actually used from, whenever they built it, like 1200, up until the 1970s.
Wow.
Yeah, and they originally built it out of hollowed-out logs and things. So the Gose River has been kind of re-maneuvered around, and the street under Gose is actually on the Goses, like literally. It's underneath that street. So
that's really cool.
Back to the salt, though.
Yeah.
So since the water is not saline in any way, the big question is, why is salt a part of Gose? And in that area, the Harz mountain area, there, not too far away, is some substantial salt mining. And where salt may have been a commodity in other parts of Europe, in that part of Europe, with a mine that close by, it was not the commodity it was in some places. It was much more available, easier to access, and cheaper.
Okay.
So I've seen people, particularly up in the Northwest, Wyoming, put salt in their beer, their lagers.
Yeah.
Give it a little more fullness, a little more
I've seen
body.
it in the Dakotas, yeah.
Yeah. So I have to assume that that's what happened, that, the Gose brewers thought, well, we have this cheap commodity and we know the effect it has on beer, and gives it some fullness, and so they put a little bit in. And when nearby towns, as Gose became more and more popular and was gaining accolades, other towns started to make Gose. And I think they just copied them and put some salt in there. And as it spread out, I think each time another brewery opened and started making their own Gose, they emulated that and put a little salt in there. And I think the same is probably true with the spices that get used in it. And that's a whole other discussion that has to do with the gruit that was used in brown beers. Mm-hmm. And I would have to guess that since there was an edict that said you had to use gruit in every beer because that's how the king made his money, or some of it, that even Gose at some point had some sort of spice mix in it. And over time, other spices got left out and coriander remained. I think that was probably accelerated when they started using hops. And hops weren't used in beer 1,000 years ago. And hops came into use in different places at different times over, hundreds of years. There looks like there's 50 or 150 year increments where you see it popping up. But one of the interesting things that I found out in my research is that, there are all kinds of reasons, like, what's the guy that wrote the Sacred Herb book? Bueller? Stephen?
Bueller? Anybody?
Bueller.
Yeah.
Anyway, I'm sorry, I can't remember his name. But he talks about, hops in his book and postulates that it was done by the church because it made you sleepy and tired, and that the gruit mixes were aphrodisiac herbs that made you wild and crazy and having lots of sex. And I found no evidence that the gruit hops were intoxicating or aphrodisiac in any way.
I don't know. If that was true, I'd say, let's make gruit again. We
can make gruit again. Those herbs are out there. And, if they were really that potent, people would be doing them right now.
That's also
in fact,
true.
We wouldn't be at the GABF. We'd be at the, Great Gruit Festival or something. And we'd all be some bacchanalian orgy over in the
all
corner.
in our lambskins, and that'd be
This is not a pretty picture we're painting.
No. All right. So you've opened up about 9 veins that I want to mine at this point, but
We can't go away until we talk about the hops a little bit before I forget.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I discovered is that when hops started being used, they are such a good preservative compared to alcohol or other gruit herbs that brewers immediately, within a few months, I believe, certainly a few years, realized that instead of making an 8% brown beer with gruit, they could make a beer half that strength, use half the amount of malt, and still get the same volume of beer. And there are even people who, talk about this in historical records and say, well, I'm reducing my recipe, my malt bill by 2/3, and I'm just going to make hop beer. So that's, I think, the main reason that hops became so popular is that the beer, you could use, a third, 2/3 the malt, or even half the malt for the same volume of beer, make a decent intoxicating beer, and it wasn't going to put people in stupors, and you didn't have to buy the gruit, and you didn't have to buy that much malt.
Yeah.
So it's a great preservative, and you get to use less malt. That's why hops became dominant.
One of the things that I'm curious about, though, back when I was the editor at All About Beer, Evan Rail did a story on Berliner Weiss for us, where he talked about how it had almost died. And you talk to Tim Webb, who's written many great books on Belgian beer, and he talks about how Lambic almost died, and Goose almost died at some point. So many of these beers that existed back in hundreds of years ago that were native to and specific to a certain region have fortunately been pulled back from the brink of completely going, off the rails. And Fred Eckart is responsible, God rest his soul, for bringing Adam beer back into the fold as well, which is now a category that's judged here at GABF as well. Did Gose ever get close to that happening?
Gose actually completely died off multiple times.
Really?
Yeah, and
not just once.
No, not just once. I cover this all in the book, so you can go out and at least buy
Everybody
one book.
should go buy the book. I'm just teeing you up, but everybody should go buy the book
right now. Run to your computer. It's on Amazon.
It's where fine books are sold.
And I'm only asking for 1 million copies sold. That's all I want. Okay, maybe 100,000 would be good. Okay, 1,000 maybe. So
100, please. Take my way.
Buy my book. Where were we?
Listen, as two writers sitting at a table together, like we could really out-desperate each other at this point when it comes to selling books. But I'm teeing you up because I want people to go buy the book. So don't give everything away, but just give just a little taste. Like just the first taste is free.
Okay, yeah. So I mean, it has died out many times, and it actually died out in Goslar before it died out, in Leipzig. So it had migrated down to Leipzig. And, and a whole bunch of reasons, which you can read about in the book.
Yes, which you should.
Are outlined.
Pause the podcast, go to your computer, buy the book, unpause the podcast. Welcome back.
Yeah.
Fal is here talking about Gose. Yeah.
So, you missed nothing. While you were
there
away,
was no
we
break.
didn't talk about
There was no break, yeah.
It's now time for the CD listeners to take a pause. So,
traffic and weather next.
This is what happens when you drink and podcast at the same time.
It's very dangerous. My entire life. Yeah.
So, Gose died out several times. My favorite story of the Gose dying out is, during it was huge in some places. It was so big that actually in Hamburg they put a special tax on imported beer to keep Gose from selling as much as it was selling in Hamburg.
Really? Okay.
Yeah. And then later in Leipzig it became so big there were something like 85 Gose taverns. And it was like the Leipzig thing. There are postcards, and you could write they sell them in the gift shops. You write your parents from some Gose tavern.
And when you're talking about taverns, is this just where it was served, or it was also where it was made and served?
Well, that's a complicated question. You have to read the book.
Yeah.
Mostly where it was served, but Gose has gone through a lot of permutations. So at some point they would do the quote brewing unquote at some spot, and then immediately put it into giant wooden casks and ship it to the places where it was going to be served, the taverns, and they would finish it off in the barrels and do the packaging.
So not unlike cask ale or not real ale back in the day, or not unlike even some of the taverns that exist today, where lager is being sent out with specific lagering tanks where the beer finishes at. Okay.
Yeah, somewhat like that, except for much more sour, I believe.
A little bit. Yeah.
But, Gose had its heyday, and then around the turn of the last century, 1900s, it started to wane, and lager beers were taken over, and it kind of died out, and then the World War II, I and II were not kind to Germany or Gose, and after World War II, the communists took over that part of Germany, and they were even less kind to Gose. They were not interested in any sort of cultural identity, and Saxony really had its own cultural identity. And so to kind of put the squeeze on that, they kind of actively worked at wiping out a lot of things, and Gose was one of them. And the last keg of Gose rolled out in the 50s, and that was it. No more Gose. And then this guy, mind blank. Lothar Goldham.
Okay.
Lothar Goldham.
Yeah.
Great name, Lothar. He thought, you know what? I was a restaurateur. I ran a hotel before the communists showed up, and now I'm a bookbinder, and I don't like bookbinding, and I want to open a place. So he went to the Onabedinken, which is the oldest Goses tavern, and it had since shut down as a tavern, and had been used for many different things under the communists. And he said, this is where I'm going to do it. I'm going to open a Goses tavern, and restore Leipzig's glory. And it was kind of a crazy dream that this guy had. And he had been planning this for a while, so he'd gotten involved with politics. And he went to, whoever is in charge of those sorts of projects and said, this is what I want to do. And they said, well, we'll support you, but you have to put in 3,000 hours of your own time restoring the place. And so he logged 3,000 hours rebuilding it, redoing the beer garden,
it seems
refinishing
like such an
the
arbitrary
wood.
number, but yeah.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, maybe it is because, again, my translating from German, maybe it's 30 hours.
Yeah.
But he, was doing this on his own time with his own money while he was still being, a bookbinder. And he would go out to flea markets, and he ran into this other gentleman, Hartmut Hennebach, and they, Hartmut was selling some of these, paraphernalia things, and that he was going to, Goldham was going to buy and put in his tavern.
Yeah.
And there were some Goses things there, and they got to talking about history of Leipzig, and they became partners. And they reopened this place, and it was wildly popular. And they, Lothar went out and talked to old brewers and talked to old Goses drinkers and found as many recipes as he could. And he took all of this information and went to a small brewery and said, listen, I want you to make this beer for me. And they said yes, and they did, and they started making Goses again. And really, he single-handedly...
From the traditional recipes, yeah.
Yeah, what they could find. And he single-handedly, rescued Goses. And when he passed away, Hennebach continued to run the Onabedinken until he passed away. And the Onabedinken's still there, awesome. They just recently, in the last couple of years, bought their own small brewery, and now they're making Goses on site. So they're a little brew pub.
But this is just another great example of committed people to a specific cause furthering beer culture. I mean, we've seen Pierre Celis, we've seen Jack McAuliffe, we've seen all of these people who have come and revived something that had long been dead that is now sort of a cultural phenomenon, if you were. And that leads me to this next question of, if you had to give the elevator pitch of what Goses is today, how do you explain to so 13% of beer drinkers in the U.S. Follow craft, the other 87% don't. So if you're talking to somebody who's in that 87%, I never heard of Goses before, it's spelled like goes, how do you explain where we are in modern terms?
Well, the elevator pitch, I got 3 minutes or 4? So
it's the tallest building in Denver, so you got about 45 seconds.
Okay,
yeah.
So it's the oldest beer style in the world, and it's a sour, slightly saline wheat beer, and it's made with about 50% wheat, 50% barley, and it is super drinkable, very thirst quenching. You're going to love it, and it's a perfect palate to put other things onto. So you can add fruit or spices or herbs. It's just a very diverse kind of beer, and everybody loves it. Men love it, women love it, small children love it.
There's an article that's running in Craft Beer and Brewing magazine, which everybody should also go to that website and subscribe to the magazine as well, where I talk to you about brewing with salt. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that I was sort of struck by is that there's so many different salts that are out there these days. And what kind of salt works best in your mind for brewing a Goses?
Well, I cover all of this in the book.
I know you do.
So...
But again, I'm just asking for just a little bit. Like everybody's already stopped and paused and went and bought the book, and this is the spoiler afterwards.
Yeah. So salt, there are a lot of salts out there, and I did a bunch of research. I tried to do a lot of research on everything, even things that I thought.
If it'll make you feel better, I'll just start giving away recipes from the old book as well, just so that people don't have to go and buy it. So you're not alone in this whole thing.
No. Everybody, I always say there are no secrets in brewing, at least from my side. So if anybody ever needs any, advice or help or a recipe, they feel free to email me. But salt, you can spend a lot of money on salt. You can, the pink Himalayan salt is just the tip of the iceberg. They got this blue salt that comes out of somewhere in the Middle East from this lake. Crazy expensive. My favorite salt during my research was Hawaiian black salt.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now that
you can buy it in the airport.
You really?
Yeah, I'm guessing
Turns
for
out,
like $50, like a quarter pound or something.
Yeah. And this salt, if you go to Wikipedia, which is a website I found, Wikipedia talks about how black salt is sacred black salt, and it actually will absorb evil spirits. So, hey, it's on Wikipedia. It's got to be true. And I thought, this is great. I can make a beer that absorbs evil spirits.
By the way, just the meticulous research you did in this book, going to websites like Wikipedia to debunk stuff is, thank you.
Well,
on behalf of all drinkers of this style.
I went where it took me.
Yeah.
So yeah,
it's weird, right? You just fell down that internet rabbit hole. All right.
Well, it
so it wards off bad spirits.
Yeah, it wards off bad spirits. But then I thought, it
until the morning,
it doesn't ward them off. It absorbs bad spirit. So I thought maybe that's not the best thing to put in your beer.
Sounds like a bacon, egg, and cheese in the morning. Then yeah.
So I recommend that you don't use Hawaiian black salt. And also, it turns out that Hawaiian black salt isn't from Hawaii.
Yeah.
They've never made it in Hawaii. It's made in California somewhere, as far as anybody can tell. The Hawaiians don't know what it is.
What a scam.
Yeah. There is Hawaiian red salt, which, of course, is the best salt on the planet. I grew up in Hawaii, so I'm obligated to say that.
Sure. I grew up on the Jersey Shore, so I'm going to steer you towards saltwater taffy, but, from Atlantic City. But, yeah, it doesn't mean either of us are right. Yeah.
But, honestly...
either way, we're going to get a disease from consuming too much. Yeah.
I tried to do good research, and there's a great article in Cook's Illustrated that talks about salt and the differences in, whether it's worth it spending your money on expensive salt. And pretty much everybody agrees, with a very few exceptions, salt is salt is salt. Now, if you're sprinkling salt on a dish, maybe you will get some of the nuances in your pink Himalayan salt or your azure blue salt or, your Hawaiian red salt. But if you're using it in cooking or brewing, you're talking the mineral content of these things is less than 1%. So it's going to be diluted and it's going to disappear and you're never going to see it again. So, and no way you're going to taste it. So if you're using any kind of salt in brewing or cooking, your best option is non-iodized sea salt.
Okay.
Of the cheapest one you can get.
And where do you find that it's best in adding into a Gose recipe?
Well, that also took a kind of weird turn. We make a lot of Gose at Anderson Valley, and we use a lot of salt, and we do it post-fermentation in the fermenter. When it's not cold yet, but it's not warm anymore. So the beer has not been actively chilled, but it's cooled on its own some. So, and that turns out that that's probably your best bet, because salt is sodium chloride, and when you dissolve it, the chloride ions don't like stainless.
Yeah.
And it's already, the more acid a solution is, the more degrading the chlorine will do. And the hotter it is, the more degrading the chlorine can be. So if you're putting your salt into the kettle, for example, on a kettle-soured beer, you're doing the worst possible thing you can for your stainless. You're subjecting it to chlorine, chloride, and you're doing it under a acidic environment that's hot.
Yeah.
And you're running through your heat exchanger, which is even worse because that metal's really thin on purpose, and you're going to get damage to your stainless.
It's going to start eating away at it.
Yeah.
Which is not something that people think about, because if you get real stainless, like that'll survive. That and the cockroaches will survive the next nuclear war. But yeah,
and it turns out stainless is not stainless. Stainless is not all that sturdy or hardy, and there are a whole bunch of different kinds of stainless. In brewing, we mostly use 304, and now we can get the engineers to geek out a bit. Really, if you're going to do this, if you're planning on making a lot of Goses or adding it on the hot side, you usually should upgrade to 316 and probably 316T with the extra titanium, and that will give you a longer shelf life for your stainless. But I'll give you an example. When I started Anderson Valley Brewing Company in the year 2000, they had a 30-barrel kettle, which they had bought from someone else. It might have been 30 or 40 years old. And its stainless was so stressed from being heating and cooled and heating and cooled and heating and cooled that it began to have stress fractures that we couldn't weld because the stainless had lost most of its integrity.
Wow.
So it would, as we'd put the welding torch to it, and it would just vaporize. It just disappear, and you couldn't run a bead down it. And so stainless does have a shelf life. It does wear out, and it doesn't like salt, and it doesn't like low pH hot salt.
So, as a brewery and Anderson Valley has transitioned in the last couple of years. I mean, you guys have been around for forever and making great beers of different styles. But if somebody says, who's the preeminent Gose brewer in the country, I think it'd be foolish not to point to what you guys are doing, at least here in the U.S. So what does that do for your longevity and your equipment? Like, you have to now think about this. Okay, we're going to make X many barrels of Gose this year. It's going to have this amount of stress, even if it's on your fermenters, even if it's on, you figured it out where it's not going to necessarily kill your brew house, but it will have an impact on your overall brewing system.
Yeah, I thought about this and I penciled it out, and it turns out that I'll be retired by the time that happens.
So somebody else's problem.
Somebody else's problem. No, we have talked about it, and I've gotten our stainless guy who makes our tanks to quote me using 316 on the interior of the fermenters. And you can use 304, on the rest of it. And the 316 is a little more expensive. I think it's worth it if we get a new fermenter that we know we're going to be doing a lot of Goses in. I would probably spend that extra money. Most of our tanks get a 2-week turn, so we're not really working them as hard as some places. We got a lot of fermenters, and so I really do think probably it'll be 20 or maybe even 30 years before we start to see any of the effects of this. But
for you guys, but smaller brewers who are doing these styles should be aware that it can degrade their system.
Yeah, if I was doing this, I certainly wouldn't be putting salt on the hot side. Our concern was that it would have some negative effect on the yeast downstream on fermentation, which the acid already does have some negative effects. But my concern would be the heat exchanger mostly, because that metal is very thin, and it's something that you depend on so completely. And to get a pinhole leak in your heat exchanger could have, disastrous effects, and it could be weeks or even months before you discovered it, and then you'd be out of business. I mean, you'd have had, if you got an infection that way, it could go on for several weeks before you noticed it, and you may have produced, 20, 30, 40 more batches of beer.
In the early days, you talked about the variety of spices that are used, and these days it seems like when you're making Gose that anything is on the table, fruit-wise especially, is where the style seems to really have hit its stride a little bit. Where do you see the evolution of the style? Where do you see us going, from this point in 2018, beyond? Because it's hard to imagine that Gose is going to disappear like it did anytime soon. And so, but it's also the natural inclination of brewers to sort of push the envelope, and you at sort of the forefront of this, and as a mindfulness of where the style came from. Where do we go from here?
Well, that's a good question, hard to say. And, if someone had told me that Gose would be a thing 10 years ago, I'd have said, no, you're crazy. Even if you told me 5 years ago, I'd have said, really? Really? Yeah. You think that a sour, salty German wheat beer is going to be the new thing? I was wrong. My boss saw this. He had vision. When we first made a Gose, I'd never even heard of a Gose 5 years ago.
Is it really that short a period of time that you guys have been making them?
Yeah. It's stunning that the success.
You got a book deal out of it too, which is pretty cool. But yeah,
very cool.
Yeah.
5 years ago, I had never heard of Gose, and most people hadn't either. And Randy Mosier, who is just a fountain of knowledge.
Yeah.
He talked about making Goses back at a homebrew U thing that was put on up in Seattle in the mid-'90s. And, nobody paid attention because it was so outlandish of a thought. We were trying to figure out how to make an IPA back then. And
right. And a clear one at that, yeah.
Right, and a bright one. And, well, that's look where that's gotten us.
Stay tuned for part 2, folks, yeah.
Exactly. Hazy Gose.
Is that in the table? Is
No,
that no?
no, there's nothing. No hazy.
So that's not part of the evolution of the style.
Who knows what's going to happen. I have seen the craziest Goses that you can possibly imagine already. I was in Berlin. A guy made a pickle Gose, which was actually pretty good.
Yeah. With just the spices, or just like actually throwing in like cukes?
Well, I think he definitely put cucumber in there.
All right.
And then he put some of the pickle spices and used pickling salt. It was a lot saltier than I would have made it, but it was interesting. And I've had ones that I've had an 11% Gose, which I don't, it's not really a Gose at that point.
What's the sweet spot for ABV?
Probably about 3.8 to 4.8, 5 maybe.
So when you get higher than that, and certainly triple that, it starts to.
I mean, it's the whole thing of how you define things. So, is a double or a triple IPA just a hoppy barley wine? I mean, I don't know. So people making a double Gose, it's just now you're doing a kettle soured, salty, super strong beer. And the one that I had that was very strong was very good. But I wouldn't have called it a Gose. It had some crazy fruit in it, and it didn't have much salt, and it was like really alcoholic, but really tasty. So I think you can do a lot of things, and I think something that people will talk about more is kettle sour versus wood souring, and a lot of people have been poo-pooing the kettle souring. There's two different kinds of things. It's like a pickup truck and a race car.
Yeah.
They're just not the same. You don't want to drive them the same. They both have a similar function. But, kettle souring is a great way for folks who want to make a clean, bright, acidic beer in a very short amount of time. And you're not going to get the complexity that you would get out of wood aging, wood souring a beer. And so in some styles that's good, in some styles it's not. I wouldn't say that, you would make a kettle soured beer and then try and pass it off by running it through wood chips or something. That would not be cool. But at the same time, I'm not sure that everybody always wants to drink a super ponderous wood aged beer with funk and Brett and God knows what else going on in there.
Right.
I love those beers, but it's not what I want to drink all the time. And you can get a little more funk in your Gose if you like. I was talking to Peter Buchert last night, and he's not a big fan of the kettle soured flavor. And
weird that a Belgian wouldn't be, but
so it's not for everybody, but I think it's certainly an interesting technique, and I think you're going to see it used more and more on other types of beers that aren't Goses. You can have other beers that are made slightly salty. I mean, slightly sour without being saline. And we've already done some experiments making sour beers that way, and mild success.
Yeah,
it's another tool in the toolbox.
I wish I had so much more time with you, because this is such a fascinating topic on a style that so many people are aware of, that you're correctly point out 5 years ago we weren't thinking about, but is so much part of the zeitgeist these days that it's hard not to think about it. And if you haven't already, folks who are listening, go out and please buy Fal Allen's new book, Gose, Brewing a Classic German Beer for the Modern Era. Fal, thanks for sitting down.
Oh, sure. Thank you for having me.
Before I leave you, I've been asking everybody who's been on my version of this podcast of what is your hope for beer?
Boy, I was talking to Charlie last night, Papazian, about how strange things have gotten, and how at least I could never have imagined any of this ever happening. When I started brewing 30 years ago, all of this was so far-fetched. The fact that we're over 10% of the beer market is
13 now, yeah.
13. It's just shocking. And the evolution of the styles we've seen and the resurrection of a lot of these styles. I would hope that we continue to do research and find, styles that have died away and resurrect them as best we can. And I think that's an exciting part of brewing. I am a little nervous about some trends, and we're just going to say it. The hazy beer frightens me a little bit, and it's not that I don't like those beers. I mean, they're perfectly fine beers as they are, but they, when you are intentionally making your beer less attractive in some ways, I don't understand it, and I fear that with that beer, I can't imagine that having extra yeast and extra wheat in there isn't going to be hard on most people's stomach, and that, like Hefeweizen, it's just not going to be a beer that lasts. So I hope we don't go too far into trendy things, although I'm sure somebody out there is going to say, well, you made Goses, dude. Talk about
right, yeah.
fruity trends that you
Hypocrite,
made.
yeah.
And I get it. I think there's a lot of room for experimentation, and I think we can make a lot of great beers in a lot of different ways. And, I just don't want us to fall into being alcoholic sodas. And I think one of the trends that we're going to see, it's just going to happen, is marijuana beer.
Oh, yeah.
We've already seen that.
It's unstoppable at this point.
Yeah, we made a friend of mine, who will remain nameless for legal reasons, made a terpene beer, and I went down and tasted it at his place in San Francisco, loved it, went back home, thought, well, he made one, I can make one. So we made one, and everybody loved it. We served it at our pub. We didn't make a lot. And so we sent, since it was a success, the boss was like, well, let's do this. And I wrote off to the TTB to get label approval. They wrote back and said, absolutely not.
Right.
You can use no part of the marijuana plant in brewing. It's a Schedule I drug. And they didn't say they would come and mess us up, but certainly reading between the lines.
Oh, it's implied.
Oh, yeah. And they're serious. And I get it. I see their point. But I think that they're going to have to come around as marijuana gets pulled off of Schedule I eventually and put somewhere else. And things like CBD and terpenes, particularly terpenes, because they have no psychoactive effect at all. They're just flavorings. And other plants make terpenes. They don't make the same ones or in the same awesome way that marijuana does. But I suspect you're going to see terpene beer.
I'm 100% with you.
Yeah. And then CBD.
Yeah. And the breweries that are doing it right now with hemp and some of the other peripheral products as well are simply laying the groundwork for the day when it can be legal, and then they'll flood the market. I think that there's a lot of brewers that are experimenting with it right now, hoping that one day it becomes legal and you'll flood the market with it. And I do think that there's a large part of the consumer base that will respond to it.
Yeah, when we made this one, we made a very small batch. It was very experimental. It took so little of these terpenes to have an impact. And the guy told me, he couldn't mail them to me. I had to go down and pick them up.
Right.
And we put it in. He's like, this is just going to get stronger as time goes on. And I said, I know beer. This isn't going to happen. But certainly it got stronger pretty much every day after we put it in there, to a point where I actually had to cut it with pale ale. It was just too strong. And this stuff costs a fortune, but you don't need much. I used probably twice as much as I should have.
Yeah. And
we're talking about milligrams of this stuff in barrels of beer. So, it's a flavoring that I just feel fairly positive that we're going to have to deal with it at some point.
Well, I will bring you back for the April 20th show next year just for thematic purposes. But Val Allen of Anderson Valley Brewing Company with his new book, Goses, Brewing a Classic German Beer for the Modern Era. Everybody, please, please, please go out and buy it. Thank you so much for being here.
Well, thanks for having me. It's been fun, John.
Thanks for everybody for listening. If you have questions for me, guests you'd like to hear on the podcast, questions or topics you'd like addressed, you can reach out to me directly at John Hall, that's JOHNHOLL at Beer and Brewing, or you can .com, or you can join the conversation on Twitter. You should also go and visit beerandbrewing.com, where you can learn how to be a better home brewer, learn from the pros, find out what's happening in our exciting beer world right now. And you can also subscribe to the magazine. Please, please, please subscribe to the magazine, because print is not dead, and much like Goses, we wanted to have a rebirth in a lot of ways. But again, Val, thanks so much for being here.
Yeah, thanks again for having me. And if anybody wants to send me an email, they're welcome to at fallen@avbc.com. Happy to answer any questions, talk about recipes, do whatever.
No, when you say fallen, though, I feel like your Hawaiian accent is coming out a little bit. Like, spell it out for us. Because people think that I founded Goose Island, which is not true, which is why I have to spell my last name.
Yeah. It's fallen as F, like, Frank, fallen, over. FALLEN at AVBC, like Anderson Valley Brewing Company.com. Or just go to the website. They got my email there.
Do it up. Buy his book. Val, thanks again. And we'll be back next week with a brand new episode. Cheers everybody. This episode was brought to you by craftbeer.com, home of the most mouth-watering map in the world, the map of U.S. breweries. If you find yourself in a new city and want to sample the local flavors, or if you just want to marvel at the vast American beer landscape, visit craftbeer.com.
This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. Learn more online or subscribe at beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew.